The day started like any other in our quiet suburban home. My wife, Eliza, and I had established a predictable routine over the years. She handled her work-from-home tasks while I commuted to the city for my job in finance. Recently, we had hired a cook named Marcus, who came highly recommended by a neighbor. His culinary skills transformed our mundane dinners into restaurant-worthy experiences, and his friendly, easygoing nature made him a favorite in the house. Marcus had quickly become part of our household rhythm. Each morning, he'd arrive with fresh ingredients, chatting with Eliza as he planned the day's meals. They seemed to get along well, and I didn't think much of it. Eliza was naturally warm and Marcus had a charming, approachable personality. Occasionally, I'd find them laughing together in the kitchen, but I dismissed it as harmless camaraderie. On this particular day, however, something felt different. I couldn't quite put my finger on it, but the air seemed heavier. Maybe it was the way Eliza avoided eye contact during breakfast, or how Marcus seemed quieter than usual as he prepped dinner. I shrugged it off, attributing it to the dreary weather. That evening, as we sat down to a perfectly cooked meal of seared salmon and roasted vegetables, I noticed Eliza lingering on her glass of wine. Her cheeks flushed faintly, and her laugh seemed a bit forced. I brushed it aside, resolving to focus on the delicious food instead of overthinking her mood. Little did I know, this seemingly ordinary evening marked the beginning of a series of events that would upend everything I thought I knew about my life, my marriage, and the man who prepared our meals. The weeks following that dinner were marked by subtle changes in the dynamic of our household. It started small, things you might not notice unless you were paying attention. Eliza began spending more time in the kitchen, often under the pretext of learning new recipes from Marcus. At first, I found it endearing. She had never been much of a cook, and Marcus's guidance seemed to spark a new hobby for her. But then came the laughter. It would echo from the kitchen while I worked late in my home office. That light, carefree laughter, more vibrant than I'd heard in a long time, struck a dissonant chord. I told myself it was nothing, just two people enjoying their shared interest. Yet, an uncomfortable knot began to form in my stomach. One evening, I came home earlier than usual. As I opened the front door, I was greeted by the sound of music, soft jazz playing in the background. The smell of fresh herbs and roasted chicken filled the air. In the kitchen, Eliza and Marcus were standing close, their heads bent over a pan. She laughed at something he said, her hand briefly brushing his arm. "Looks like a party in here," I said, trying to sound casual. They both jumped slightly, turning to face me. Eliza's smile seemed a bit too bright. "Oh, hey. Marcus was just showing me how to deglaze the pan." Marcus nodded, his usual confidence a touch muted. "Mr. Bennett, dinner will be ready in a few. Hope you're hungry." I nodded, trying to shake off the unease. Over dinner, I watched them carefully. Eliza seemed more animated than usual, and Marcus, while professional, seemed to engage with her more than necessary. I told myself I was imagining things, that I was being paranoid. But doubt, once planted, has a way of growing. That night, as I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I couldn't help but wonder, was there something more beneath the surface? The days turned into weeks, and the feeling of unease persisted, though I tried my best to push it aside. Eliza seemed happier, more radiant, even, but the change felt out of sync with our usual rhythm. It wasn't the kind of joy that came from us or the life we'd built together. It felt separate, like a secret she held just beneath the surface. One Friday evening, I decided to surprise her by coming home early with her favorite flowers, an effort to reconnect amid the growing distance I was beginning to feel. As I pulled into the driveway, Marcus's car was still parked out front. That wasn't unusual. He often stayed late to clean up after preparing dinner. I entered the house quietly, flowers in hand, and heard their voices coming from the kitchen. They weren't loud, but the tone was intimate, like a private joke being shared. I hesitated in the foyer, my heart pounding in my chest. "You make it sound so easy," I heard Eliza say, her voice light and teasing. "Well, you just need the right touch," Marcus replied, the playful edge in his voice unmistakable. It could have been nothing. It could have been about cooking, for all I knew. But something about their laughter, the way it seemed to fill the air with an energy I hadn't heard in years, made my grip tighten around the bouquet of flowers. Steeling myself, I walked into the kitchen. They both turned to me, startled. Eliza's face flushed, but she quickly smiled. "You're home early," she said, her voice overly cheerful. "I wanted to surprise you," I replied, handing her the flowers. Her smile faltered for the briefest second before she took them, murmuring her thanks. Marcus wiped his hands on a towel and glanced between us. "I was just finishing up here," he said. "Dinner's ready, so I'll get out of your way." He left quickly, his usual easy demeanor replaced with a subdued silence. Eliza busied herself arranging the flowers, her back turned to me. The air between us felt thick, charged with unspoken words. That night, as we sat at the dinner table, I couldn't bring myself to enjoy the meal. The flavors Marcus had so carefully crafted tasted hollow, tainted by the doubt that had begun to consume me. Eliza made small talk, oblivious, or perhaps pretending to be, to my growing suspicion. For the first time in years, I wondered if the foundation of our marriage was beginning to crack. That weekend, Eliza seemed determined to keep herself busy. She spent hours in the garden, something she hadn't done in months, then announced she wanted to try baking, a hobby she had no interest in before Marcus came into our lives. She pulled out recipes, borrowed Marcus's stand mixer, and filled the kitchen with the smell of fresh pastries. "Why this sudden interest in baking?" I asked casually, leaning against the kitchen counter. She glanced at me with a smile, her tone deliberately light. "I thought it'd be fun to try something new." Marcus said it's therapeutic. The mention of his name brought a slight tightness to my chest. "Therapeutic, huh? Did you need therapy?" She laughed softly, but there was an edge to it. "Don't be silly. It's just a fun project." She turned back to her dough. The conversation closed before it could go any further. Over the next few days, I noticed a pattern. Eliza had begun texting more frequently, always quick to swipe her phone away when I walked into the room. When I asked her about it, she shrugged. "Just some work stuff," she said, her smile a little too practiced. One evening, while she was in the shower, I couldn't resist the nagging curiosity. Her phone buzzed on the nightstand, the screen lighting up with a notification. The message preview was short, "Can't wait to see you tomorrow." The sender was saved as Jenna, but something about it didn't sit right. Eliza hadn't mentioned plans with a friend, and Jenna wasn't someone she spoke about often. My chest tightened as I considered whether I should scroll further. The thought felt invasive, but the doubt in my mind was becoming unbearable. Instead, I put the phone down and left the room. I tried to dismiss it as a friendly message, but the seeds of doubt were growing faster now, roots tangling around every moment of normalcy we tried to maintain. The following day, I made a decision. I told Eliza I had to work late, though my schedule was clear. Instead, I parked my car a few blocks away and returned to the house on foot. Marcus's car wasn't in the driveway, which calmed me slightly, but the lights in the kitchen were on. Peeking through the front window, I saw Eliza at the table, her laptop open, and a glass of wine in her hand. She looked content, absorbed in whatever she was reading. For a moment, I felt foolish. Was I letting my insecurities poison what was probably just a harmless friendship? As I watched her, trying to convince myself everything was fine, Marcus's car pulled up. My breath caught as he stepped out, holding a bag of groceries. He rang the bell, and Eliza greeted him at the door with a warm smile. Their voices carried faintly through the open window as they walked into the house together. "You didn't have to do this," she said. Marcus chuckled. "Well, I thought we could try something new for dinner tomorrow. Besides, I owed you one." My chest tightened as I stood in the shadows, my mind racing. Owed her one? For what? I turned away, walking quickly back to my car, my heart pounding with every step. Something was happening, and I wasn't sure how much longer I could ignore it. The next morning, I sat across from Eliza at breakfast, her cheerful chatter flowing around me like background noise. My mind was elsewhere, replaying the previous night in a relentless loop. I had wanted to confront her immediately, but doubt and fear held me back. What if I was wrong? What if I accused her unfairly and shattered the trust we had built over the years? "Eliza," I said, cutting into her story about the garden. She looked up, her expression open and curious. "How late were you up last night?" I thought I heard someone come over. She froze for a fraction of a second, barely perceptible, but enough to notice. Then she smiled, brushing a strand of hair behind her ear. Oh, Marcus dropped by. He wanted to go over some menu ideas for next week. Nothing exciting. Her answer was casual, but it didn't sit right. Since when did Marcus make house calls outside his regular hours? Didn't seem like a quick visit, I said, trying to sound offhand. She laughed lightly, her tone dismissive. You're imagining things. It was nothing. I let it drop, though my heart was pounding. Her denial had been quick, too quick. I resolved to dig deeper. Later that day, I stopped by Marcus's apartment under the pretense of dropping off a bottle of wine as a token of appreciation for his excellent cooking. He seemed surprised to see me but welcomed me in. His place was modest and neatly kept, the walls adorned with travel photos and shelves stacked with cookbooks. I wanted to thank you for everything, I said, handing him the wine. You've been doing an incredible job around the house. Marcus smiled, the picture of sincerity. That means a lot, Mr. Bennett. I enjoy working with your family. We made small talk for a while, but my real purpose was to observe. There was nothing overtly suspicious about him. No misplaced pictures, no signs of Eliza in his personal space. Still, the nagging feeling in my gut wouldn't dissipate. As I was leaving, I noticed a small, elegant scarf draped over the back of his couch. A scarf I was almost certain belonged to Eliza. My mind raced as I fought to keep my composure. Nice scarf, I said, motioning to it. Marcus hesitated briefly before replying. Oh, it's a friend's. She must have left it here the other day. I forced a smile and left, my hands shaking. The threads of doubt were now weaving into something more tangible. That evening, I couldn't bring myself to mention the scarf. Instead, I observed Eliza more closely, every glance, every movement, every word. She was cheerful, but there was an undercurrent to her demeanor, a secretive edge that hadn't been there before. As I lay awake that night, I knew I was teetering on the edge of a revelation I wasn't sure I wanted to face. The pieces were beginning to fall into place, but I still clung to the hope that I was wrong. Over the following days, I couldn't shake the image of Eliza's scarf on Marcus's couch. It gnawed at me during meetings, lingered in the quiet moments at home, and invaded my dreams at night. I told myself it could have been anyone's scarf, a coincidence, but deep down, I knew better. Eliza's behavior only fueled my suspicions. She began spending more time out of the house, claiming she needed fresh air or errands to clear her mind. The laughter from the kitchen when Marcus was around grew louder, and the way they exchanged glances felt charged. I started keeping track of her movements, noting the times she left and returned. It wasn't something I was proud of, but I couldn't stop myself. I needed clarity, even if it led to a truth I didn't want to face. One evening, I pretended to work late again, but instead of staying at the office, I parked down the street and waited. Sure enough, Marcus's car appeared just minutes after I left. This time, however, he didn't enter through the front door. Instead, he walked around to the back, carrying a small box. Curiosity burned in my chest as I approached the house from the opposite side, careful to stay out of view. Through the gap in the curtains, I could see them in the dining room. Eliza was seated at the table, her face lit with an expression of pure delight. Marcus placed the box in front of her, and she opened it with the excitement of a child unwrapping a gift. Inside was a small, ornate pastry, a delicate creation that looked like it belonged in a high-end patisserie. Marcus leaned in, explaining something as she smiled and listened intently. She took a bite, closing her eyes in exaggerated enjoyment. He laughed, leaning back against the chair with an ease that felt too intimate for someone who worked for us. It was a scene I couldn't unsee, too personal, too comfortable. I left before they could notice me, my thoughts spinning. That night, Eliza climbed into bed with a soft sigh, her hair damp from the shower. "Long day?" she asked, her voice casual. "Yeah," I replied, my tone flat. "Yours?" "It was fine," she said, rolling onto her side. "Nothing special." Her words stung, each syllable a tiny betrayal. I stared at the ceiling, the darkness of the room matching the heaviness in my chest. The The cracks in our life were no longer small, ignorable fractures. They were widening, and I was no longer sure if they could be repaired. The following week, I couldn't focus on anything. My work suffered, my conversations felt hollow, and my patience ran thin. Eliza noticed, asking repeatedly if I was okay. Each time, I brushed her off with a vague answer. How could I explain the war waging in my head without tipping my hand? The breaking point came on a Thursday evening. Marcus was supposed to be off that day, yet his car was parked in our driveway when I arrived home. My pulse quickened as I entered the house, quiet as a shadow. From the living room, I heard their voices. "You didn't have to come today," Eliza said, her tone soft but insistent. "I wanted to," Marcus replied. "Besides, I needed to make sure everything was perfect for tomorrow's dinner." Eliza laughed lightly. "You're too much sometimes, you know that?" My stomach churned. I stepped back out of view, my mind racing. Tomorrow's dinner? I hadn't been informed of any special plans. The ease of their interaction felt too familiar, too intimate. That night, I made a decision. If Eliza wasn't going to give me answers, I would find them myself. The next day, I left for work earlier than usual, but instead of heading to the office, I stayed close to home. I needed to see what this mysterious dinner was about. As the evening approached, I parked down the street, the shadows of dusk cloaking my car. Marcus's car pulled up first, carrying trays and bags of ingredients. He disappeared into the house, and minutes later, the faint sound of laughter reached me through the stillness. Eliza's car left soon after, though she returned within an hour, carrying a bag from a boutique I didn't recognize. As the clock ticked toward dinner time, I debated whether to confront them immediately or wait. A part of me clung to the hope that this was innocent, a miscommunication, an overly friendly work relationship, but another part of me knew better. Finally, unable to take the suspense, I walked toward the house. My steps felt heavy, each one echoing with the weight of impending revelation. As I approached the dining room window, I froze. The table was set more elaborately than I'd ever seen. Candles, wine, and plates arranged with meticulous care. Eliza and Marcus stood close together, her hand resting lightly on his forearm as he gestured toward the dishes. They were smiling, their conversation inaudible but full of energy. And then, she did something that stole the breath from my lungs. She reached up and brushed a speck of flour from his cheek, laughing as she did. Marcus caught her hand, holding it there for a moment too long. I turned away, my heart pounding. The missing piece had finally clicked into place. This wasn't just in my head. There was something between them, something that didn't belong, but I wasn't ready to confront her. Not yet. I needed to know how far this went, what lines had been crossed. The dinner went on without me as I sat in my car, grappling with the storm of betrayal building inside me. By the time the candles burned low and Marcus left, I had made up my mind. This wasn't over. The days following that evening felt surreal. I moved through life as though on autopilot, my mind consumed by the images of Eliza and Marcus. Every interaction with her felt like an elaborate charade, a performance she played with ease while I struggled to keep my emotions in check. I knew confronting her now would be premature. If I wanted to uncover the full truth, I needed to approach this carefully. Rushing in with half-formed accusations would only give her the chance to twist the narrative. One evening, while Eliza was out running errands, I began setting up my plan. I'd always been meticulous in my work, and this situation was no different. I installed a small, inconspicuous camera in the living room and another in the kitchen. They were subtle enough to go unnoticed and would allow me to see what was happening when I wasn't around. Part of me felt guilty, like I was violating the sanctity of our home, but the growing evidence of her emotional distance made the guilt easier to bear. If she was betraying me, I deserved to know. The first few days of footage yielded nothing substantial. Eliza and Marcus were professional in their interactions when I was present, and there was no sign of him when I wasn't. I began to wonder if I had imagined the intimacy I'd seen. Then, on a quiet Thursday afternoon, I caught something. Eliza had taken the afternoon off work, claiming she needed a mental health day. I left for the office, but an hour later, Marcus's car pulled into the driveway. Watching the footage later that evening, my chest tightened as I saw him step into the house, carrying a small bouquet of flowers. He handed them to Eliza, who smiled warmly before placing them in a vase on the counter. Their conversation was muffled, but the way they moved around each other felt too natural, too easy. At one point, Marcus leaned closer, and Eliza laughed, swatting at his shoulder playfully. I paused the video, staring at the frozen frame. The evidence wasn't explicit, but it confirmed what I'd been fearing. This wasn't just a friendly relationship. The next morning, I decided to test the waters. "You had a quiet day yesterday?" I asked Eliza over breakfast, keeping my tone light. She nodded, sipping her coffee. "Yeah, I just needed some time to recharge." "No visitors?" I pressed, watching her carefully. She hesitated, just for a moment, but quickly recovered. "No, just me." "Why do you ask?" I shrugged, masking my growing anger. "No reason." Her life felt like a knife twisting in my gut. Whatever was happening between her and Marcus, she was keeping it from me. It was time to take things further. I wasn't going to wait for the truth to come to me. I would uncover it myself. After confirming Eliza's lie, I became more determined than ever to uncover the full truth. I expanded my efforts, taking care not to tip her off. If she suspected I was watching her, she might become more cautious, and I couldn't afford that. Over the weekend, I installed another discreet camera in the dining room, angling it to capture conversations over meals. I also added a tracker to her car, a small device that would let me see where she was going during her increasingly frequent outings. The first few days provided little insight. Eliza's movements seemed routine. Errands, occasional stops at the grocery store, and visits to a local cafe. I began to wonder if I'd crossed a line, spying on her without definitive proof of wrongdoing. But then, on a Tuesday afternoon, the tracker alerted me that she had stopped in an unfamiliar neighborhood, a quiet residential area about 10 miles from our home. I pulled up the location on my phone. It wasn't near any businesses or friends I knew of, and she stayed there for over an hour. That evening, I casually asked her how her day had gone. She smiled, her expression open. "Just the usual. Ran some errands and worked from home." My stomach churned at her lie, but I kept my face neutral. "Anything interesting happen?" She shook her head. "Nope. Pretty uneventful." Her casual dishonesty felt like a slap, and I barely touched my dinner that night. My appetite was replaced with a mix of anger and dread, each bite turning to ash in my mouth. The next day, I reviewed the camera footage from the dining room. I froze when I saw Eliza and Marcus seated at the table, wine glasses in hand. Their conversation was just audible. "I shouldn't have come here again," Marcus said, his voice low. Eliza leaned toward him, her expression soft but conflicted. "You know it's fine. It's not like he'll notice." The casual dismissal of me in their conversation made my chest tighten. I rewound the footage, replaying it to ensure I hadn't misheard. "You know it's fine. It's not like he'll notice." The words replayed in my head, each repetition cutting deeper. Whatever their relationship was, it had crossed a line. The trust one had placed in her, believed in so deeply, felt shattered, replaced by a cold, suffocating anger. I resolved to follow her the next time she went to that neighborhood. If she wouldn't tell me the truth, I would find it myself. The tracker buzzed 2 days later, notifying me that Eliza had returned to the same residential neighborhood. My heart pounded as I grabbed my keys, knowing this could be the moment everything changed. The drive felt endless, my thoughts racing between dread and determination. As I neared the address, I parked a few blocks away and walked the rest of the distance. I didn't want her to see my car and suspect anything. The house was modest, with a neatly trimmed lawn and curtains drawn over the windows. Marcus's car was parked in the driveway, its unmistakable vanity plates confirming his presence. I crouched behind a row of bushes, trying to steady my breath. What was I expecting to find? I told myself I wasn't certain of their betrayal yet, but deep down, I knew. Through a gap in the curtains, I caught a glimpse of them inside. Eliza and Marcus were sitting close on a plush sofa, a wine bottle and 2 glasses on the coffee table. She laughed at something he said, her hand resting on his thigh. He leaned toward her, brushing a strand of hair from her face. I felt frozen, like my body refused to move while my mind screamed at me to look away. But I couldn't. The scene continued to unfold, confirming every suspicion I'd tried to bury. Then came the moment I couldn't deny. Marcus reached for her, pulling her into a kiss. She didn't hesitate, her arms wrapping around him as they melted into each other. My breath hitched, a sharp, involuntary sound that felt louder than a gunshot in the quiet street. I stumbled backward, desperate to escape without being seen. Once I reached my car, I sat inside, trembling. My chest felt hollow, as if the air had been stolen from my lungs. It wasn't just suspicion anymore. It was fact. Eliza, my wife, had crossed a line she could never uncross. When I returned home that evening, she greeted me with a warm smile, acting as though nothing was wrong. "How was your day?" she asked, her tone light. I stared at her, my heart breaking under the weight of what I'd witnessed. But I couldn't confront her yet. Not here. Not without preparing myself for the fallout. "Fine," I replied, forcing a tight smile. "Just fine." The lie tasted bitter, but I swallowed it. The truth could wait a little longer. For now, I needed time to figure out how to tell her what I knew, and what it would mean for us. The next morning, I woke before Eliza, my mind already racing with how to approach her. Every time I thought about what I had seen, my stomach churned and my chest tightened. There was no turning back now. I had to confront her. She came downstairs later than usual, dressed casually in her favorite sweater and leggings. She smiled at me, looking so at ease that, for a fleeting moment, I doubted myself. Could I really shatter this image of normalcy? "Morning," she said cheerfully, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "Morning," I replied, my tone flat. She paused, glancing at me. "Are you okay? You seem off." I set down my mug, the ceramic scraping against the table louder than I intended. "Actually, Eliza, we need to talk." The warmth in her expression faltered. "What's wrong?" I stared at her, willing myself to stay calm. "I know about Marcus." Her reaction was immediate. Her eyes widened, and her face drained of color. "What are you talking about?" she asked, her voice wavering. "Don't," I said, cutting her off. "Don't insult me by pretending you don't know. I've seen the way you act around him. I've heard the lies you've told me. And yesterday, I followed you to that house." Her mouth opened and closed, but no words came out. She looked like a deer caught in headlights. "I saw you," I continued, my voice shaking with anger and pain. "I saw you with him, Eliza. You kissed him. You—" I stopped, unable to say more. Tears welled up in her eyes. "I can explain," she whispered. "Explain?" I scoffed, standing up abruptly. "Explain what? That you've been sneaking around with the man I trusted to work in our home? That you've been lying to my face for weeks, maybe months?" Her tears spilled over, and she buried her face in her hands. "It wasn't supposed to happen," she sobbed. "I never meant to hurt you." I clenched my fists, struggling to keep my composure. "You never meant to hurt me? Eliza, every choice you made hurt me. Every lie, every stolen moment, every touch with him. It wasn't an accident. It was a choice. Your choice." She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. "I still love you," she said desperately. This didn't mean anything. I got caught up in something stupid, but it doesn't change how I feel about you." I shook my head, the words hollow in my ears. "If you loved me, you wouldn't have done this. You wouldn't have betrayed me." For a moment, silence filled the room, the weight of my words pressing down on us both. "What happens now?" she asked finally, her voice barely above a whisper. I took a deep breath, trying to steady myself. "I don't know yet, but things can't go back to the way they were." She nodded, tears still streaming down her face. "Please, just give me a chance to fix this." I didn't respond. Instead, I walked out of the room, leaving her alone with her guilt and the mess she'd created. The house felt unbearably quiet after our confrontation. Eliza stayed in the kitchen for what felt like hours, and I paced in my office, replaying her words in my head. Her tears, her apologies, they all rang hollow. How could I believe anything she said now? That night, she approached me cautiously as I sat on the couch, staring at the darkened TV screen. She looked like a shadow of herself, her usual confidence replaced by uncertainty. Can we talk? She asked softly. I nodded, not looking at her. She sat on the armchair across from me, folding her hands in her lap. I don't even know where to start, she said, her voice trembling. Start with the truth, I replied, finally meeting her eyes. How long has this been going on? Her gaze dropped to her hands. A few months, she admitted. I let out a bitter laugh. A few months. So while I've been living my life, trusting you, you've been sneaking around with Marcus. It wasn't like that at first, she said quickly. It started innocently. We talked, we laughed. I didn't realize how far it had gone until it was too late. Too late? I snapped. It wasn't too late when you let him kiss you. It wasn't too late when you lied to me, over and over again. Her shoulders shook as she cried, but I felt no sympathy. The betrayal was too raw, too overwhelming. I'm sorry, she whispered. I hate myself for what I've done. I love you, and I want to make this right. How? I demanded, my voice rising. How do you make something like this right, Eliza? How do you undo the damage you've caused? She had no answer, her silence speaking louder than any words could. That night, I slept in the guest room, unable to share the same bed with her. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her with Marcus, the betrayal replaying like a broken record. The next morning, Eliza tried to act as if things were normal, but the tension between us was suffocating. She made breakfast, her movements mechanical, and placed a plate in front of me. I didn't touch it. I've told Marcus he can't come back, she said suddenly, breaking the silence. I looked up at her. And that's supposed to fix this? It's a start, she said, her voice pleading. I'll do whatever it takes, I swear. I stood up, pushing the chair back with a screech. It's going to take more than firing him to fix this, Eliza. I need time to think, to decide if this marriage is even worth saving. Her face crumpled, but I walked out before she could respond. I needed space, distance from the house, from her, from the suffocating weight of her betrayal. I drove aimlessly for hours, trying to process everything. The future felt uncertain, and for the first time in years, I wasn't sure if we had one together. The days following my confrontation with Eliza felt like an endless limbo. We coexisted in the same house, but it was as though an invisible wall separated us. She tried to bridge the gap, leaving notes of apology on the kitchen counter and texting me throughout the day, but I ignored them all. Her words felt like empty gestures, meaningless in the shadow of her betrayal. On the third day, I decided to meet with a friend I trusted implicitly, David, someone I'd known since college. We met at a quiet cafe, and after some small talk, I laid everything out for him. She cheated, I said bluntly, watching his expression shift from curiosity to shock. With who? He asked, leaning in. Our cook, Marcus. The words felt bitter on my tongue. David let out a low whistle. That's unexpected. How'd you find out? I recounted everything, the suspicions, the cameras, the tracker, and finally the confrontation. His expression darkened with each detail. Do you think there's any salvaging this? He asked. I shrugged, leaning back in my chair. I don't know. She says she wants to fix things, but how do you come back from something like this? How do I trust her again? David nodded solemnly. You don't have to decide now. Give yourself time. But don't let her guilt manipulate you into staying if you can't forgive her. You deserve better. His words stayed with me as I drove home. I couldn't deny that a part of me still wanted to believe Eliza's remorse was genuine. But was that enough to outweigh the betrayal? When I returned home, the house was quiet. Eliza was in the living room, staring blankly at the TV. She glanced up as I entered, her eyes red-rimmed from crying. We need to talk, she said softly. I hesitated but finally sat down across from her. What is it? I want to tell you everything, she began, her voice trembling. Not just about Marcus, but about why it happened. I braced myself, nodding for her to continue. She took a shaky breath. I've been feeling disconnected for a while. From myself, from us. I thought I was handling it, but then Marcus came along, and he filled a void I didn't even realize I had. Her words stung, each one a fresh wound. So this is my fault? I asked, my voice cold. No, she said quickly. This isn't about blame. I made a horrible mistake, and I'll regret it for the rest of my life. But I want you to understand where my head was. I stared at her, searching her face for sincerity. She looked utterly broken, but I couldn't ignore the part of me that wondered if she was just trying to salvage what little she could. I don't know if I can forgive you, I said finally. Her lip quivered, but she nodded. I'll do whatever it takes. Counseling, therapy, anything. Just don't give up on us. I stood up, unable to sit still any longer. I need time, Eliza. Don't push me. She nodded again, tears streaming down her face as I walked out of the room. That night, I lay awake in the guest room, staring at the ceiling. David's words echoed in my mind. You deserve better. For the first time, I began to consider what my life might look like without her in it. The days stretched into a week, the silence between Eliza and me growing heavier with each passing moment. She tiptoed around the house, offering hesitant smiles and awkward gestures of kindness that only deepened the chasm between us. I avoided her when I could, throwing myself into work and spending evenings at the gym or in my car, parked at the edge of a nearby lake, where I could think without distraction. During one of those evenings, David called. Any progress? He asked after I filled him in on the week's events. I don't know what progress even looks like, I admitted. She's trying, at least she says she is, but I can't stop seeing her with him. Every time she looks at me, all I feel is anger and hurt. That's normal, David said gently. But if you're staying just to avoid making a decision, that's not progress. You have to ask yourself, can you ever truly forgive her? And if you can't, are you willing to live like this? His words stayed with me as I drove home. Could I forgive her? Could I look past the betrayal and rebuild the life we'd built together? Or was the damage too great, the wound too deep? That night, Eliza cornered me in the kitchen. I can't keep doing this, she said, her voice trembling. This limbo. I know I've hurt you in ways I can't undo, but I need to know if you're willing to try. If we're going to have a chance at saving this. I looked at her, taking in the dark circles under her eyes, the trembling hands clutching the edge of the counter. She looked like a woman unraveling, but I couldn't muster much sympathy. I don't know, Eliza, I said, my voice hollow. How do I trust you again? How do I look at you without wondering if you're lying to me, sneaking behind my back? Her eyes filled with tears, but she didn't look away. I'll spend the rest of my life proving to you that I'm sorry, that I'm committed to you and only you. But I can't do that if you won't let me. Her plea hung in the air, and for a moment, I wanted to believe her. I wanted to believe that the life we'd built together wasn't beyond repair. But David's words echoed in my mind. You deserve better. I need to think, I said finally. She nodded, wiping her eyes. Take all the time you need. I'll wait. I'll do whatever it takes. That night, I began to draft a letter. It wasn't a decision, not yet, but it was a step. I wrote about the pain of her betrayal, the loss of trust, and the uncertainty of our future. I wrote about the life we had shared and the doubts now shadowing every memory. By the time I put the pen down, the letter felt like both a farewell and a cry for clarity. I wasn't ready to give it to her yet, but I knew the time to decide was drawing near. The question wasn't just whether I could forgive her, it was whether I even wanted to try. Another week passed, each day heavier than the last. Eliza continued her efforts to win back my trust, leaving handwritten notes in places she knew I'd find them, cooking meals she thought I'd like, and proposing therapy sessions. I remained distant, her actions feeling like whispers against the roar of my hurt. On a rainy Friday evening, I decided it was time. Time to end the limbo, to have the conversation that would shape the rest of our lives. I found her in the living room, curled up on the couch with a book she wasn't really reading. Her head snapped up when I entered, her eyes filled with a cautious hope that twisted the knife in my chest. Can we talk? I asked, my voice calm but firm. She nodded, setting the book aside. Of course. I sat in the chair opposite her, the letter I had written days ago clutched in my hand. I've been doing a lot of thinking, I began. About us, about what happened, and about what I need moving forward. She leaned forward, her hands clasped tightly in her lap. And I've come to the conclusion, I said slowly, that I can't forgive this. I can't move past what you did, Not because I don't want to, but because I don't think it's possible. Her face crumpled, tears spilling over instantly. Please don't say that. We can work through this. I'll do anything, to fix what I've broken. I shook my head, feeling the weight of my decision settle over me. It's not just about fixing what's broken, Eliza. It's about the trust you shattered, the vows you broke. I can't look at you the same way anymore. Every time I think about us, about the life we built, all I see is what you took from me. Her sobs grew louder, her hands covering her face. I love you, she choked out. I love you so much. Please, don't give up on us. I loved you too, I said softly. But love isn't enough, not when it's been tainted by betrayal. I placed the letter on the coffee table between us. This is everything I've been feeling. Everything I wish I could say without falling apart. Read it when you're ready. She reached for the letter with trembling hands, her tears staining the paper before she even opened it. I stood, knowing there was nothing more to say. I'll stay with David for a while, I told her. Take some time to figure out the logistics. I'll talk to a lawyer about next steps. She looked up at me, her face streaked with tears. So that's it? I hesitated, the weight of years together pressing down on me. That's it. I turned and walked out the door, the rain soaking through my clothes as I stepped into the night. My heart ached with the finality of it all, but for the first time in weeks, I felt a flicker of peace. I had made my decision, and now, I could finally start moving forward.